Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event, Rebuilding Lives, which is an opportunity to talk with Jessica Goudeau, author of After the Last Border. We are excited to be collaborating this evening as the International Rescue Committee in Northern California, along with Amnesty International, the Sacramento group, and a couple other groups. I'm excited to introduce you to the coordinator of California Amnesty International Groups, Diane Rosenblum.
Hello, thanks for coming tonight. Amnesty International in California is pleased to co-sponsor this event. A special thanks to Amnesty International chapters in Sacramento, the East Bay, and the San Fernando Valley for help in organizing and advertising this event. As you know, Amnesty International is a worldwide human rights organization. Refugees and displaced persons experience human rights violations on many levels. First of all, human rights abuses and violations by governments or armed groups are a major cause of people being displaced. Once they are displaced or forced from their homes due to government actions or inactions, they face a tremendous number of human rights abuses as they flee and try to find a safe place. They might be denied the right to move, the right to safe access, the right to not be forcibly returned to the place they fled. They are treated sometimes in a subhuman manner simply because they have been displaced. They're forced into detention facilities or denied access to shelter, food, education, and the opportunity to make a living. As a nation with resources to spare, the United States is well suited to resettle many of these people into new homes. Today, we will discuss this and find ways that we can all help. It's a great honor for Amnesty International to again collaborate with IRC California as they provide essential services and welcome refugees to our communities. Amnesty International is honored to be the ones who can help educate the community about the ways that IRC helps our immigrant neighbors. And we're going to learn more about that as we go along. We've created a resource page for you, and I want to show that to you very quickly so that you can get to it later on. If you go to amnestysacramento.org/refugees2021, and you might want to write that down, you can find all sorts of actions, links to the IRC offices that are closest to you in both Northern and Southern California, etc. And also things you can ask your legislators to do, etc. So we're gonna give you that link again later on, but I would like for you to try to write it down. Again, amnestysacramento.org/refugees2021. Missy?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. And the International Rescue Committee and Amnesty International have a long-standing collaboration and partnership, and we're excited to be joined together again for this event. The International Rescue Committee has 4 offices in Northern California: Turlock, Sacramento, Oakland, and San Jose. Again, in that link, you can find more resources for actions that you can take and more to learn. But I want to get us started and give a full introduction to Jessica Goudeau. Jessica Goudeau is the author of After the Last Border, 2 Families and the Story of Refuge in America, which won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize, a Christopher Award, and was named a New York Times Editor's Choice book. She has a PhD in literature from the University of Texas. She has spent more than a decade working with refugees in Austin, Texas, and was the co-founder of Hill Tribers, a nonprofit that provided supplemental income for Burmese refugee artisans for 7 years. As an author and activist, she works to ethically and authentically bring the stories of people who have become vulnerable because of war or persecution or cruel policies or oppressive systems that keep them from being able to speak out to an audience that needs to hear who they really are and what really happened. passing it over to Jessica Goudeau now to share with us tonight. Thank you.
I am so thrilled to be with you again. I was saying I really wish I could join you actually in Northern California. No offense to where I am here in Austin, but I'm sure that it is more beautiful where you are now than it is here, where it's over 100 degrees, probably until the end of time. But I'm excited to join you guys again. And I just really want to say a huge thank you to Amnesty International as well as IRC Northern California. The work that you guys are doing is so extraordinary. And I feel like so often we don't always get a chance to connect with the people that are doing some of this, but I knew about IRC and Amnesty International years before I ever had the chance to become an author because of the extraordinary work that you were doing, both in your local communities and around the world. And so it means a lot to me that you would have me join you today. When we first started talking about this event tonight, Missy and I had worked together on another event. I think it was just one, but it feels like it was more because we've had some good conversations. And we wanted to talk a little bit about my own journey of getting to know former refugees. And so I want to tell you that we're going to have a question and answer time at the end of this. And if anything in my story resonates with you, or if you have questions, I will be the first one to tell you I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I felt deeply ignorant about what it meant to become a refugee, and so a lot of my story was really about how I first encountered a group of people, and then how they really absolutely changed my life. This is not the career I set out to do, but like many of us, those first early friendships lead to a much richer, much more rewarding life than we ever envisioned. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, but I want to make sure that you know that we'll have a time for question and answers at the end. If you want to talk about weaving and all kinds of, I've just got a lot of weird things that I've done in the last few years. So the story really for me begins when I was reading a book. I was teaching a class at the University of Texas called The Devil's Highway. It was for a class about the rhetoric of undocumented immigration. And so I set out to find out a little bit more about what it meant to be someone who was undocumented. I was teaching this class as a graduate student instructor, and it was one of those times when I felt really convicted that the thing that we were talking about was an issue for me and not people. So I live here in Texas. We came to the University of Texas. We came to Austin so that I could attend the University of Texas. And just the idea that I knew more from reading than I actually knew from experience really bothered me as I began to teach students. I was in a classroom full of what we called dreamers at the time. Many of them had come over with their parents and were staying here. It was a very precarious time. So I set out when there was a call at a community center nearby. My husband and I and our 10-month-old daughter went to go help out. So we lived in South America. We were there to go translate some healthcare pamphlets into Spanish. I fully intended for the day to go in one direction, and instead it went in a totally different direction. So while we were there, I've got my kid, it was Halloween, so I've got my kid dressed in this like octopus costume. And of course it was like, she is my first daughter, and it was a classic Austin mom mistake that I dressed her in this like sweltering octopus costume. So she's like 10 months old and she's sweating and just sitting there, and I'm trying to pass out all these pamphlets, and in walked this group of people that really seemed deeply out of place in the middle of this community center in Austin. I had spent 2 summers in northern Thailand teaching English, and so I recognized that this were a group of people that were what they call the Karen Hill Tribe. So that's the ethnic group, Karen, and Hill Tribe is the word that many people have adopted, that those people within that group often use in English to refer to the kind of separate ethnicity that they have. They're part of, I didn't know this at the time, one of the persecuted groups in Myanmar, though this group also extends throughout other parts of Southeast Asia. And I just really enjoyed getting to know one of the women. So I've ended up using the name Muna as a pseudonym for her. She was my first former refugee friend. And I walked around this fall festival teaching her and her children. She had like a 5-year-old and 2-year-old, I think, at the time, and she was pregnant. I taught them about bobbing for apples and like how to jump in the bouncy castle. And it was just really rewarding for me. I went home that night and began Googling what it means to be a refugee. There was someone there who kind of explained like these are former refugees. And I think at the time they just used the term refugee. I'll talk in a minute about why I say former. And I just knew nothing about it. So a few things that I think are important. Many of you are going to know this better than me. There are 3 different types of immigration categories that we talk about that are separate, that I think are really going to help us in our conversation. And this is going to be important when it comes back to the Q&A at the end. There are economic migrants, and those are people like my ancestors who came over to the United States. My ancestors came from Wales and from Germany and from England, seeking better economic opportunity. Many of us who are here in the United States are the children of economic immigrants who just wanted a better life and perhaps access to better education, a chance to provide more fully for their children. Sometimes those people come over with or without documents. The documentation process has changed significantly, but those are economic migrants. Asylum seekers come into the United States because they are fleeing persecution or war, and they're trying to conflict, or for whatever reason, they are going to either die or have significant injury. And so it's just not safe for them to stay there anymore. Most, if not all, refugees start off as asylum seekers. So they are proving to a government or to officials that they would be persecuted or killed if they stayed in their home country. Refugees are people that have received the official designation. It's a legal designation from groups like UNHCR, and I will defer, by the way, to there are people here that are significantly better at the legal jargon of all of this, but they've received the official designation that they are refugees and they are in need of resettlement. The vast majority, 99% of refugees in the world will never be eligible for resettlement. So less than 1% of people actually come to the United States through the refugee resettlement program. This was long before the closed door policies that really began in about 2015 here in our country. So the group of people that I met had come when George W. Bush was president, and he began opening up there was a real need for people to be resettled from Myanmar. At the time, this was kind of before the current war as it is. And so there were a lot of people that had been living in camps. I didn't know this until I began researching the book. The average wait for people who live currently in protracted refugee situations around the world is almost 30 years. So many people had been living there their entire lives. They knew nothing other than this. So when I got to know this group of people through Muna, I learned kind of just through my friendships about what it means to be a former refugee, about what displacement is. Displaced is the word that we use for people who need to move, whether they're internally displaced people or they're having to flee across the border because they can't stay where they are. Muna introduced me to this entire world. We got together a few weeks later, began asking her with my English. She is just an absolute sponge when it comes to languages. What are some things that she needed? Could I connect with her friends? And over time, a group of friends and I here in the US, here in Austin, began developing this woman-led cooperative in which we followed the lead of the women that were mostly staying at home. So there were several people here, Refugee Services of Texas resettles people like IRC does in Northern California. And they were helping people get jobs, but there was this group of women who were staying at home because they had babies, or they were the grandmothers who were watching grandkids. Sometimes it was neighbors watching other people's kids. And there just was this kind of at-home group of women who all had kids. So my friend Karen and I started showing up and just hanging out. And a few weeks in, they said, would you mind teaching us English class? It's really hard for us to get downtown to the English class. And so we started teaching them a few things in English, and eventually realized that many of them were weavers. And to make a long story really short, we somehow figured out how to get yarn from northern Thailand. I know the tiniest bit of Thai, but I know just enough to order like the certain amount. Like the taklots and jai were some of the Thai words that we had to figure out in order to like get the exact measurements for the kind of yarn that they use. And for 7 years, we helped these women, and there was one man who did it. They wove. So this was the kind of traditional artistry that women had been using for, generations. The word Karen in their language actually means weaver. So they're known for their weaving throughout the region. And we helped these women make bags and scarves, and we worked on products, and we kind of set them up in all these ways to have economic development opportunities. We started a fair trade festival. We took their products to other fair trade festivals and developed this whole community of people really helping these former refugees. It was wonderful and one of the richest experiences of my life. And at the end, over 7 years, we had 30 women, more or less, that we helped. And at the end, 2 of them were left and everyone else had gotten full-time jobs. In fact, Muna is still in the full-time job that we had some friends helped her find. And it really, I thought, what a beautiful ending to this incredible story. It was like my kids got to be raised in this community that was so beautiful. I mean, we would go and like play soccer, and it was just, you can never replicate this kind of thing. There were people literally from all over the world living together in one apartment, and we would sit outside and eat watermelon and, you know, hang out with everybody and work on different products. And it was just such a beautiful way to spend 7 years. At the end of it, 2 of the artisans were left and they wanted to launch their own businesses. And so we gave them funding and helped them start their products and start their own businesses, and successfully ended our nonprofit, and thought, this is it. I'm done with this chapter of my life. So I graduated with my PhD. I got a job here in Austin, and I was sitting, I was able to run a writing center. So I was the interim director of the writing center here at a university in town, which is kind of like, nobody I knew was able to get this kind of job and be here. I was feeling pretty great about where things were with my career when the rhetoric really shifted around refugees. It is not for me, and I want to be really clear about this, it's not about any one particular politician or even a party. It was a real drastic turn. Those of us who had worked with refugees for years had always seen this beautiful bipartisan, interfaith, cross-community, amazing group of people that work together. It's this perfect blend of the public-private partnership that we're always hoping that the government can find with other groups. And suddenly things really began to shift around refugee resettlement. I reached out to people in my community and said, does anyone want me to tell their story? And I couldn't keep up with it. And over the next couple of years, I ended up leaving academia in order to write full time and tell the stories of people so that the world could understand, so that readers could know these aren't people coming to take our jobs. These aren't people that we should fear, but these are people who are real complex humans who deserve to have their story told. So that's the background of my relationship with former refugees. And I think for those of us who are in this conversation, it's often the way that it happens that this begins through friendship. This is very relational work for many people. Most people that I talk to in these conversations have a story of a time when they learned something and it really changed for them. There are a few things I want to talk about, and I really would like to open this up to questions at the end. I have a few ethical values that are really important to me when I write the stories of former refugees, and then I'll read a little bit about Muna's story. Because of my PhD, I studied Brazilian and American poetry. So I'm like one of the world's leading scholarly experts on Brazilian poetry in the 1950s. So if anybody ever nobody ever takes me up on this, but if anybody wants to know about like concrete poetry in the 1950s, I am totally your person. But one of the things that I did in my scholarly work was point out or argue all of the ways in which white people have done damage by telling the stories of others. And so I'm deeply aware, almost to a fault, of the pitfalls that happen when someone in power is telling the stories of people who are not in power. Often we talk about this in terms of race, but for me, I think it really matters that it is about power and access. So those of us who have access to publishing, those of us who have access to education, have had generational access to education, are in a position of power. And we have to be incredibly careful how we tell the stories of those who face obstacles to publication or obstacles to telling their story. For me, that has looked like a deeply embedded interview process in which for this story, I spent 2 years interviewing Muna and another woman, Hasna, who's from Syria. I spent 2 years, every 2 weeks, interviewing them for several hours in order to get layered details about everything that happened. So though this is a work of journalism, I wanted it to read like a novel because I wanted readers to feel like they were like just sitting right behind Muna as she encountered everything that happened in the very earliest days of her being there. I was not there for most of the things that happened. And so I relied on her first person testimony. And it's due to Muna and Hasna's diligence and extraordinary work that this book has had any of the success that it has had at all. One of my great griefs is that I can't share this with them. We used pseudonyms because both of them face danger in their home countries. In fact, we were a little bit thinking like, things are getting better in Myanmar. Maybe we don't have to be as careful. And this coup that happened earlier this year has made us incredibly glad that we were as careful to protect their identities as we could be. What I hope someday, I cannot wait for the day when I can stand and share their picture and stand with them in front of others and really honor the extraordinary work that they did in this. But until that day, I am a reluctant mediator and sharing their stories. So I would like to end my conversation with a reading, and then I'll kind of set us up a little bit for discussion. So this is what the book looks like. I'm very proud of this yellow and pink cover. I think Viking just did such an extraordinary job. But it's so much easier to read on the PDF because you don't like see the top of my head. So I do most of my readings from the computer here. But I want to read a little bit from when Muna first arrived in Austin. And so this was, again, something that happened kind of through several conversations. And it, for me, as someone who has traveled quite a bit, this part of the interview really stood out to me. I think so often we think about when people cross the border. So the book begins with the prologue of the first time that Muna crossed a border when she was fleeing violence as a very little girl, leaving Myanmar. But I think so often we think about the journeys that former refugees take, that we have these stereotypes in our head of people in a boat crossing the Mediterranean, or people crossing a desert. And sometimes just the act of going in an airplane and arriving in another airport is incredibly traumatic and overwhelming. And so for Muna, who had never left Melak, who had left Melak camp only to go back into war and then to come back to a camp, the process of coming to the United States was almost, I've said before, it was almost as if I went back 100 years and brought one of my ancestors from a farm and said, come here to the United States. Like the technology and all of it was so overwhelming. And so I want to begin with Muna's arrival in April 2007. Muna stood on the landing above the airport baggage claim area at Austin Bergstrom International Airport and wished she had on different shoes. She shifted the plastic International Organization for Migration bag. Those of you who are familiar with refugees just recognize that IOM bag from her left shoulder to her right and grabbed her daughter's hand. There were 2 escalators leading down. She and her husband Saku had instinctively paused, not sure which one to take. People passed them on the right and left, confidently moving through spaces Muna never had. Muna's shoes, the black rubber slide-on sandals everyone used in Melak camp, felt dusty, undignified. She was proud of her skirt and shirt. These were her nicest clothes. They were red and hand-woven in the traditional Karen style, a long straight skirt with braided fringes brushing the top of her feet, a tunic with a diamond-shaped hole she slipped her head into. She looked at her daughter Nawa, who was 2, in her pink Karen dress, and her other daughter, Papo, who was 5 in a turquoise one. Even Saku, holding Papo's hand, had a green tunic he wore with jeans. In the tiny airplane bathroom, Muna had rebraided the girl's hair, and Saku had slicked his hair down with water from the tinny sink. She had heard from friends at the camp that she would get a black sweater and new shoes on the bus to Bangkok. There had been no shoes and no sweater, though Muna had looked behind the bus seats to make sure. She was too shy to ask the UN workers at the time, but she had not stopped worrying about her rubber sandals in every airport, afraid they seemed shameful to the IOM worker guiding them, that the lack of new shoes meant that she had missed some important step everyone else knew that she did not. Now the IOM worker was gone. That was another piece of information they had heard in the camp, this one accurate. They would know they were boarding their last flight because the IOM worker would not go with them. Muna had barely known the woman, but now felt bereft without her. That woman had been certain and knowledgeable, guiding them through their travels by reading the long lists of names on huge signs overhead in each airport, and then translating them into their native dialect, Karen, from Bangkok to Los Angeles. Muna could read several things in English already, but she could not understand why the large A22 meant you were on a flight to Dubai, and A23 meant you were going to Hong Kong, but A24 meant Los Angeles. It was one of thousands of things Muna did not grasp. Muna's entire life had been spent with people who looked like her. Occasionally, a white UN worker or volunteer came to the camp, but that was it. Everywhere she turned were people with different eyes, ears, hair, noses, clothes, skin, mouths, purses, hats, hijabs, necklaces, bracelets, wallets, suitcases, books, food, water bottles, headphones, scarves, pillows, sweaters, shoes. Even when her eyes were down to shield her from the onslaught of strange sights, the languages assaulted her ears, snatches and tones she had never heard, musical, guttural, loving, rude. The smells of perfume, food, sweat, air conditioning kept her from breathing in deeply. Now, in Austin, standing in her last airport at the top of 2 escalators going down, she wished desperately for one brief minute that they were back in Maylock camp. She wished the IOM woman were still with them. She wished she had her new sweater and shoes. They had only seen an escalator a handful of times, most of them in airports within the last 24 hours. She turned and gazed blankly at her husband for a minute. Saku walked to the escalator on the left, almost running into a white businessman pulling a suitcase behind him. Muna fell into place behind him. She stumbled for a minute, eyes down to keep her balance, clutching the rail that made her hand move slightly faster than the stairs on which she stood. She made sure Nawa's tiny feet were centered in the metal striped step. When she finally reached the bottom of the stairs, anxiously avoiding the steps submerging into each other, Muna took a firm step with Nawa over the line that ended the escalator, then looked up. She didn't have time to worry. A man was already greeting them in Karen, standing beside a tall white woman with a wide smile. Are you Saku and Muna? We're here to take you to your new home. Welcome to Texas. Muna's face broke into a relieved grin. Missy, I think if you guys are ready, let's move to the raffle.
Thank you so much. What I so appreciate about that section in particular is just really articulating how overwhelmingly different things are. So we're going to take a brief moment here. So please, please, please submit your questions now while we raffle off some copies of After the Last Border. So submit your questions and I'll pass it over to Henry to host the book raffle.
Hello, I'm Henry Gordon, a member of the local Amnesty International group in Sacramento, California. We're very proud to be hosting this event, and I'd like to thank Jessica for a terrific presentation and to thank all of our participants, people who made the time to join our event tonight. For those of you who have not read the book yet, I think that you're in for a really good read. You'll be drawn in by the stories of the 2 women, which are really emotional and compelling. And Jessica has interspersed chapters that trace the long history of US refugee policy. And I found them very informative and comprehensive. And I think everybody who reads the book will learn a lot from that as well. So we're pleased that we can raffle off, award 10 copies of the book. And the names that I draw will be contacted by email, and we'll make arrangements to have the book sent to you. So I'm going to do this raffle the old-fashioned way. I've got my book with the names of our attendees in it, and I'm going to call out some names right now. Again, if we call your name, we'll be contacting you later by email to get you the book. Madhu Singh, Alice Smith, Jesus Salas, Linda Glick, Nestor Fantini, Seraphim Winslow, Joyce Wolf, Linda Reed, Jonathan Partridge, and Beatrice Hildebrand. Congratulations to our 10 winners. And I'm going to turn it back to Missy for the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we want to kick off with a couple questions. Feel free to keep sending them in. The first question to kick off with, Jessica, is really about the term refugee. So it went from a term that really inspired compassion to thinking about being terrorists. So how do we overcome this in our current context and moving forward, certainly under a new administration?
I think understanding a bit about the history of how this happened for me has been incredibly helpful. So I will go ahead and tell you there's no way tonight I'm going to answer in some sort of definitive way of like how we turn the tide of public opinion, but I do actually have some thoughts on this. So in this book, the format of the book, as Henry said, and thanks Henry for kind of talking a little bit about this, traces the story of Muna coming from Myanmar, the story of Syria, of Hasna coming from Syria, and the history of refugee resettlement in the US. And really, and this is, I like to take credit for it, but really it's because my editor is a genius. So we sold the book to her at auction, and the very first time we sat down, we had this just amazing lunch. And here I am so excited to meet with my editor from New York. And I'm also a little bit overwhelmed because I'm like, this is just a very big topic. Like, how do you talk about all of these things? And she said, we're telling the story of who we used to be when Muna was here, what refugee resettlement used to look like, the story with Hasna of who we have become, and with refugee resettlement, the history of it, we're begging the question, is this really who we want to be? So for me, the act of writing this history was an act of really reflecting on what has changed in the last over a century of refugees coming to the United States. I have felt very overwhelmed at times at the way that things have changed. Like, for example, I didn't realize that the Refugee Act of 1980, which implemented the current federal refugee resettlement program, that passed the Senate unanimously. Like, I just can't even imagine any act of immigration just passing the Senate. Everybody's like, cool, we want to vote for refugees. That sounds great. At the same time, things were significantly worse in the 1920s, even in the years during when what was happening in the Holocaust was known to everyone in power in Washington. They knew what was happening, and still they did nothing. It took the changing of public opinion after World War II to really begin putting the things in place that eventually led to refugee resettlement now. And for me, that gives me a significant amount of hope. I don't know, those of you who have been around former refugees, I don't think I have ever seen this community as engaged, as aware, as fired up as we are now. And I think we can see that in the way, and we can talk about some of this politically, but even under a new administration, this is a community in the United States of thousands, if not millions of people who are not willing to wait any longer for the good work that we know needs to be done, for the fixes that need to be made to the federal refugee resettlement aid program. And because of that, I have a lot of hope, because I feel like we are doing the work to educate those around us. And so I think these kinds of local and regional efforts are actually the most important thing, because refugee resettlement, while international and also national, is really hyper local. It's really about the people that you know in your city and in your neighborhoods and the restaurants and the, communities and mosques and synagogues and just community centers and all of those places that band together around us. And so the thing that continues to give me extraordinary hope, I have goosebumps now when I'm talking about it, is how many people are engaged and how much they care about what is happening now and what the next few years really mean for the refugee resettlement program.
Thanks, Jessica. We have another question going back to the 1% resettlement figure that you gave about the number of folks. And is this just for US refugee acceptance or global for all countries that have a formal process for receiving and resettling?
Okay, so I'm also going to defer to those of you who work in resettlement, because these numbers change significantly. I am stating, and Missy, you correct me if I'm wrong, before refugee resettlement changed in the US in 2015. Still less than 1% of people were resettled anywhere in the world. Isn't that correct?
1%, that's what I'm familiar with as well, as part of the near, at this point, over 22 million refugees, specifically out of the now nearly 70 displaced, 1% get resettled. And that's resettlement in any country that has a formal process for receiving and resettlement.
And not to get too into the weeds, but I actually found this really important and helpful. UNHCR has begun using 2 different categories to talk about people who are in vulnerable situations. One of them is displaced people globally, and one of them are actually what we talked about earlier, the visa category of refugees who have the chance to be resettled. So we're not even talking people who are living in vulnerable situations or precarious situations within their own country or within their own communities because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, or a variety of other factors, right? And so it is such a minuscule number. That's part of what makes this so incredibly disheartening sometimes, is there were so few people already who had access to this life-saving program. And now for that to be as shut down as it has been in the last several years, and for us to face the kind of anti-refugee language that we've been seeing is really, it feels like I keep grabbing my gut. Like it feels kind of like really just like a gut punch for those of us who care about this issue and these people. It's not just an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And really thinking about the people, there's another comment here about how the interviews really did result in such great detail and narrative. Can you speak a little bit more about the interview process and what really stood out, and that really, I mean, even articulating the print on the teacups, it painted that you were right there with them, and that's why it's such a powerful experience to read these stories.
So much of the credit of this goes to Muna and Hasna. Muna and I have been friends, like close friends. Like she's on my phone. She's in the like top 15 people that I would call when I've had a few hard things happen in my life, and she was one of the top 3 when I was like, how do I move past this? Like she's someone whose opinion I really value. And so when I began the process of writing, because I knew her so well, I thought, I know the story. Like this isn't going to be that hard. So I just kind of go in and throw some things. And so I just asked her one day, what was it like when you arrived? What do you remember? What are some things that kind of stood out to you? And the story she told me that eventually became that first chapter was nothing like what I thought. That she started with her shoes, and I, just kind of went on from there. And she just has this incredible, she's just so smart, just an incredible grasp for detail and this just really amazing memory. I think those of us who are familiar with people who've gone through trauma, you often have one of 2 responses. Either it's like a hyper attention to detail or almost an inability to remember. And so I had both of those with Muna and Hasna. When I first met Hasna, I was kind of actively looking for someone else because I knew that Muna's story was going to be really interesting, and I had begun the process of writing this, but I wanted to juxtapose her story. So it was almost like an audition process. I did an interview with someone sometimes, and they were like, it sounded like you auditioned people, and it really did feel that way. So I just began interviewing as many people as I could. And the minute I met Hasna, I knew. The minute I saw her eyes, I knew she was the person. But when we sat down in our first interview, it was just so stunning, her ability to kind of tell me some of this information. So so my nanny died several years ago, but she was my mom's mom. She was one of those people that could talk your ear off. And it didn't matter if anyone was nearby, she would talk to the wall. She just had a lot of stories to tell. And I have found actually that people who like to tell those kinds of stories make for the best interviewing partners. And when I first met Hasna, she spent an hour describing in detail the plants around her courtyard at her home. And I thought, this is it. This is the person. And some of it is funny because it's part of who she is. She's very gregarious. She's very warm. I have never been to her house. The pandemic was so stressful for her because I would show up and not drink coffee. And it was just a source of enormous stress that I would like not eat and not drink coffee at her house. She has made the most elaborate meals for me. We used to take turns hosting each other. So I would cook, and then we had a translator named Amina who would also cook with us and share with us. And the 3 of us formed this just really extraordinary bond. But Hasna really wants people to know. She really wanted to go back through her home and remember the carpets and talk about the paintings and the details of her neighborhood. And so for me, no matter how the book was received, the gift that I felt like I was able to give Hasna and others whose story I receive is to really hear and remember and honor what has been lost. And I think part of what I often ask people in the act of reading the book is that it is an act of remembering. It's an act of kind of claiming the space for people who have been through so much and who have lost so much and who are often forgotten or dismissed as part of this nameless, faceless crowd. And I think the interview process in which she gave me all of these details. So really for me, the secret was just these extraordinary women. And then I asked them as many questions as I could for 2 years. And then I typed up the answers until I just like absolutely wrecked my hands and turned that into this narrative. But I really wanted to make sure that I was able to really capture the like visceral details of what they've been through.
Was there anything that feels like didn't make it in the book that felt really critical?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So because we used pseudonyms, we also changed the details about their lives. Hasna's family in particular was like right at the center of things as the war in Daraa, the city where the war in Syria began. They were very close to a lot of the action. There were a handful of stories that are so good. But when we put them into the book, we realized there's only one person in the entire city who might have been in that story, and it was one of Hasna's relatives. And there were a couple other things that really made it clear who this family was. And so my editor, who is just so good at this kind of stuff, worked very closely with me at changing the identifying details. So the first draft I wrote just straight as, you know, these are the details, these are the names. And then we began to kind of change and shift some things so that we could make sure that we were not putting their families in danger. This is not how most editors work. In fact, I had a major publication just turn a feature down because they really liked it and would only publish it if I didn't use pseudonyms. But I, in general, when I'm working with people who are displaced, refuse to use their real names because it puts them in danger. And so I'm incredibly grateful to my editor and the team at Viking for their willingness to work with me in making sure that we're telling the story, but also hiding the things that need to be told. This, I feel, is one of the few roles for someone like me who's a friend to former refugees, but is not herself a former refugee, because I'm able to say some things and type some things and get some things to an audience, and I still can do it in a way that protects and provides a cover for people who are still vulnerable. And so I think I was very glad I was able to work with a team that did that. But I do sometimes really wish I could tell those stories. They're so good.
And we will await the day that it's safe enough, and admire your work in protecting that to elevate the stories for all of us. So we have another question asking to go back to really clarify the distinction between displaced persons and refugees. So I'll share here a little bit how I've described it, and then Jessica, please feel free to chime in and elaborate. And so really thinking about displaced means that you have had to leave your home, but you haven't had to leave across a country border. Internally displaced versus a refugee is someone who has had to cross a border and is therefore receiving that status. The status, the specific visa status, there's a refugee visa status and special immigrant visa. Is another kind of visa. And so this I will tie to an earlier question that we received that was really in the Sacramento area, asking about who we resettle. And in Sacramento and across Northern California, one of the primary populations we have the privilege of resettling are special immigrant visa holders. And that's a special visa that's given to folks from Afghanistan who have served at least 2 years in support of American troops, and that has therefore put them and their families in danger. And so we across Northern California receive folks from Afghanistan. We hope in the near future to see an increase, particularly of folks from Syria. We're seeing an increase in Lautenberg applications for family reunification for folks from Ukraine and Russia. We have some East African populations that Assyrian that we resettle in Northern California, and each of our offices have slightly different populations that we resettle. One of the largest populations of folks being resettled are from the DRC in the United States, but not significantly in Northern California. So I touched on a couple questions there. Checking in here with Diane, are there other questions that you have? We do have a comment to give one of the copies of the books to Biden. Thank you.
Right, that's a good idea.
Books.
I did have a question in your book, Jessica. You mentioned that several times that Hasna kept waiting for the world to wake up and realize that the Syrian people needed help. And then also there were times when Muna and her friends were concerned that the world should know what happens to ethnic minorities in Myanmar. Is there a way that we can let refugees know that we care about what they've been through without having them relive their trauma?
Oh, I love that question. So part of the thing that one of the great griefs I encounter anytime I do interviews with former refugees, and I have done, I mean, dozens, if not hundreds at this point, is just that moment of, if I tell my story, or if people only really knew, then they would care. Like, what is the tipping point that's going to move international communities to action when entire, millions of people are being hunted by their government? One of the griefs that I have is that I can never really ever change people's future by hearing their stories. I had a conversation the other day with another journalist who is working on a book that's coming out in October. It's with a man named Mandiant Dagan. I can't remember it, but I'll get the title in a minute because it's so good. And I was talking to Jenna Krajewski, and one of the things we were saying is how hard it is to hear these stories and to see people say, okay, if I tell you, everybody's going to know. And we know, and then really nothing. And so I do want there to be change. And I do hope that receiving and telling these stories and the work that all of us are doing to share them is helpful. But I know that there's not like one book that's really going to change the story, or one podcast, or one movie. What it takes is this kind of massive tide of all of us sharing these stories. And so I think the question of how we communicate with former refugees without doing damage is one of the most important questions. So for me, I would say, and I would love to hear as well from you guys who work with former refugees, the answer for me is always doing this through relationships. So the best way that I know to support people who are in precarious situations, or to communicate with them that I'm here for them, is to be a good friend. This does not mean coming to them and saying, hi, I've just met you. I know that you're learning a language and you and your family just arrived. I'm so happy that you're here. The war was terrible. Do you want to talk about it? That's not the thing that needs to happen. The metaphor I often use is one of my best friends had cancer, and she got so tired of that being the thing that defined her and the only thing that people were able to talk to her about. She's just a really beautiful person who had an incredibly complex life, and she wanted to talk about herself, and cancer was a very small part of that. So I, who was one of her best friends, could call her and say, how was chemo? And we could talk. But strangers on the street that would see her, and want to talk to her because she had lost her hair, it was just really off-putting. And so I think really the answer is, do what you need to do, volunteer, work well with the groups that are doing this. This is not a stalk refugees and go try to find them and work outside of this. Is sign up and meet the needs that IRC has in your area, find out ways to work with them. How can you support IRC by giving to them financially? How can you help them set up apartments? What volunteer needs do they have? And through that process, supporting the people that are helping refugees and eventually becoming friends with refugees. Who knows how many years into that process you can begin having those kinds of conversations. But I think the best work that people can do is to really support the network that is already around refugees in doing the very complicated and very important work that they do. Nobody's asked me to say this. I say this anytime I talk with a refugee resettlement agency, because I think this work is so undervalued. I don't know how all of you continue to do this, and yet it really takes local communities supporting and kind of undergirding and holding you guys up for you to keep doing the work you're doing.
Thank you so much. I've got a couple more questions, and then I want to wrap back around to that point where we'll be sharing a little bit more about the IRC and ways that you can support. So one question is that we're really hopeful for refugee resettlement to continue to increase and for the opportunity to welcome new refugees in California. Do you believe that Austin is prepared for the for the increase? And then I'll talk about Northern California.
We are in a very different place from you. What is interesting about being in Texas right now is that I'm not sure there has ever been a state that was more welcoming to refugees. No, I know for a fact, other than California. So we represent the two states that had the highest number of refugee resettlement cases, number of people coming. I believe, I want to say Texas and California had more than most other countries, like the two of our states combined. Don't quote me on that, because I'm not the best with numbers. So sometimes I'll start saying things. So like, don't 100% quote me on that. But like between California and Texas, we were resettling tens of thousands of people per year. And then when refugee resettlement closed in 2015, though we like to lay the blame at President Trump's door, much of that rhetoric began with Texas politicians. So Governor Greg Abbott, Ken Paxton, who was our attorney general, was actually very instrumental in closing the door to former Syrian refugees who were coming. Ted Cruz, our senator, spent a lot of time really campaigning when he was a presidential candidate. So what was happening in Texas kind of led the charge against refugee resettlement. And Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, Amarillo, Lubbock, Abilene, Midland, San Antonio, you name these cities, the people in these communities have really rallied around refugee resettlement. And so this is not the end of the story in Texas. Here in Austin, we are super ready for more refugees. Whether the state of Texas is going to be difficult about it or not, I know Refugee Services of Texas has which resettles 3% of all refugees that come to the United States, has done an extraordinary job of really holding themselves available and open for when the time comes. So there are so many of us who are really ready for that, no matter what our government, Texas government says. And I really look forward to the time when we can return to being the state that we often were, which is supporting people from a bipartisan interfaith standpoint. And I'm really sad we've neglected that. Missy, what about California?
Yeah, I mean, we are absolutely eager and ready while we are increasing. For example, we're all staffing up. So we're grateful to be in the position where we're able to hire more staff in preparation to receive new arrivals. We've continued to diversify and expand services to former refugees and folks who have already arrived in the last 4 years, while also receiving some of the highest number of new arrivals during the last 4 years in Northern California across our IRC offices. So we have not only sustained, we have grown, and we continue to grow to be able to welcome and support these newly arrived refugees, former refugees, immigrants, survivors of human trafficking, foreign-born survivors of crime. We have diverse services to support refugee and immigrant communities in each of our 4 offices. Again, that's in Turlock, Sacramento, Oakland, and San Jose. So one of those offices might be close to you. We have offices further south. So if you're joining us from further in California, we also have IRC offices in LA and San Diego. So Jessica, to your point before, connecting with your local office and understanding what the need is and being flexible with that. We're trying to do the best we can to connect the incredible talent and resources of our communities to meet the needs of the folks that we have the privilege to welcome and resettle. And larger than that, so in addition to financial donations, which are always important, there's in-kind donations for home setups. We're about to have to find a lot of homes, and those are really invaluable to help offset the cost of resettlement, to have more of their initial funding support go towards rent. That's really critical towards stabilization. There's also opportunities to volunteer, or we have robust internship opportunities. Now that has become a little bit trickier in our remote environment, but check in and connect and see with your local office what there might be that's available. That's really connected through our offices, but attending events like this, sharing in this conversation, taking the conversation with you and to your community and your family, and identifying those ways that you can connect. Jessica, you really mentioned and support around resettlement. And I would say, while IRC is a secular resettlement agency, we have an incredible partnership with interfaith and faith-based organizations that are truly invaluable, in addition to the diversity of support. So, do you have a business? Can you hire refugees? Come talk to me. There's so many ways. So thinking about what you have, you could host your own fundraiser. We've had a 15-year-old who hosted a dinner to raise money and donated it, and another family that hosted a concert for their friends of musicians that played to raise money. So there's really dynamic ways that you can engage in and support.